"Stop right there!" he barked, his voice cutting through the airport chaos. All eyes turned as the sharp sound of tearing fabric echoed in the security line. A woman gasped, her expensive dress now ripped, exposing more than just her dignity. "You can't do this to me," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Watch me," the TSA agent sneered, his arrogance dripping with disdain. But what he didn't know was that the woman he humiliated wasn't just any traveler, and her next call would change everything. What happens next? Stay tuned for the unexpected twists in the story. Before we dive into the story, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a situation like this? Or perhaps you faced a moment where standing up for what's right was the only choice? Let us know, where are you tuning in from today? It's always amazing to see where our stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss heartwarming and inspiring stories about equality, love and compassion on this journey of kindness. Let's jump right into today's story. Alicia Bennett strode confidently through the sliding glass doors of Sapphire Regional Airport. She radiated poise in a fitted, high-end dress, the kind that seemed to command attention without effort. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she wheeled her small suitcase behind her, exuding an air of calm determination. This trip to New York was more than just another business engagement. It was a pivotal moment in her career. She was set to pitch her innovative proposal to a prominent corporation, an opportunity that had taken years of hard work and perseverance to secure. To Alicia, her outfit wasn't just a fashion statement. It was armor, a symbol of the obstacles she had overcome as a black woman in a world that often underestimated her. Yet, as she approached the security checkpoint, a familiar unease settled in her chest. The bustling crowd and the hum of airport announcements couldn't drown out the memories that crept into her mind. She remembered a past encounter at another airport, where an overzealous security agent had singled her out for an invasive search. The implicit bias in their tone and actions had been unmistakable, leaving her feeling exposed and diminished. Alicia shook her head slightly, dispelling the thought. "Not today," she murmured to herself, steadying her breath. "Focus." She adjusted her blazer and stepped forward, her eyes scanning for the shortest line. But as she reached the queue, her attention was caught by a man in a TSA uniform. His name tag read Brandon Wells. Brandon's gaze locked onto her almost immediately, his eyes lingering just a moment too long on her dress. It wasn't admiration, it was something sharper, tinged with disdain. Alicia could feel it, the way his lips curled into a smirk as though her confidence was a personal affront to him. As she placed her belongings in the grey bins, Brandon sauntered over, his tone dripping with false politeness. "Ma'am," he said, his voice just loud enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. "This dress you're wearing, not exactly what I'd call business casual. Headed to New York for some fun, huh?" Alicia looked him directly in the eye, her expression calm but unyielding. "Actually," she replied evenly, "I'm here for work. Now, if you don't mind, I'd appreciate it if you'd focus on yours." Her response, delivered with quiet authority, seemed to catch Brandon off guard. For a moment his smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered, gesturing toward her shoes and bag. "Remove those, please, and step over here for additional screening." Alicia complied, her movements deliberate and controlled. She was determined not to give Brandon the satisfaction of seeing her ruffled. As she stepped into the body scanner, she noticed a man in line watching the exchange. His expression was sympathetic, but he said nothing, only shaking his head slightly before turning away. The scanner beeped, and Alicia stepped out, expecting to retrieve her belongings and continue on her way. But Brandon wasn't finished. He scrutinized the screen, frowning theatrically as if he'd found something suspicious. "Step aside, ma'am," he said, motioning her toward a smaller area for a manual pat-down. Alicia's jaw tightened. She could feel the weight of the stairs around her, the growing unease in the pit of her stomach. Brandon's actions were technically within protocol, but his demeanor made it clear this wasn't about security. This was personal. She moved to the designated area, maintaining her composure. As Brandon began his unnecessary inspection of her belongings, she caught sight of the man from earlier again. He hesitated for a moment as if considering saying something, but ultimately he just turned away, disappearing into the crowd. By the time Brandon handed back her bag with a smug, "You're all set," Alicia's confidence hadn't wavered, but her patience had been stretched thin. She took a deep breath and walked through the final checkpoint, her head held high. She told herself that this was just another obstacle, another test of resilience. But deep down, a small voice warned her, this wasn't over. As Alicia made her way through the terminal, her steps steady and deliberate, the weight of the encounter lingered. She tried to shake it off, focusing instead on the bright, airy space of the airport and the promising day ahead. Her presentation in New York was an opportunity of a lifetime, one that could redefine her career and bring her closer to her long-term goals. But no matter how hard she tried, Brandon Wells' smirk lingered in her mind, like a stain on an otherwise pristine morning. She found a quiet corner near her gate, setting her bag down and pulling out her tablet to review her notes. The familiar rhythm of preparation usually calmed her, anchoring her focus and reminding her of her purpose. But today, the memory of Brandon's deliberate actions and mocking tone felt intrusive. She adjusted her scarf absently, scanning the outline of her presentation without fully absorbing the words. Her thoughts drifted back to earlier encounters. Alicia had faced similar moments of prejudice before, instances subtle enough to be dismissed by onlookers, yet blatant enough to sting. Each time she had managed to rise above, using those experiences as fuel to push herself further. But this morning, the targeted scrutiny of her appearance, her clothes, her very presence felt particularly raw. She glanced up briefly, noticing the ebb and flow of passengers around her. A mother hurried past with a stroller, her toddler clutching a juice box. A group of college students huddled together, laughing loudly as they compared boarding passes. Life went on around her, oblivious to the quiet storm of emotions she was trying to contain. A voice over the loudspeaker announced her flight's boarding time, jolting her from her thoughts. Alicia gathered her belongings and stood, smoothing the front of her dress as she moved toward the gate. She told herself again to focus, to let this moment fuel her resolve rather than diminish it. As she handed her boarding pass to the agent, a fleeting thought crossed her mind. What if people like Brandon Wells didn't have the power to make others feel small? What if her work could lead to a future where no one had to endure these microaggressions? She didn't yet have an answer, but the idea planted itself firmly, a spark of determination to carry her through the day. Alicia took her seat by the window, settling in as the plane taxied down the runway. She gazed out at the sprawling city below, the horizon glowing faintly with the morning sun. This was her moment, her chance to show the world the strength and brilliance that Brandon had so casually tried to undermine. She thought of her son Ethan, his bright eyes full of curiosity, and her husband Jonathan, always standing steadfast beside her. They were her anchors, her reason to keep pushing against barriers. Alicia smiled faintly, letting the thought of her family ground her. As the plane lifted off, Alicia felt a sense of renewal. Whatever challenges awaited her in New York or beyond, she would face them head-on. Brandon Wells's actions had been meant to diminish her, but she knew better. She was more than his judgment, more than his smirk. She was Alicia Bennett, a woman who refused to be defined by anyone else's expectations. And this was just the beginning. As Alicia reached for her suitcase and prepared to leave the security checkpoint, she allowed herself a small sigh of relief. She was eager to put the unpleasant encounter behind her, but just as she turned toward the terminal, a sharp voice called out, halting her mid-step. "Ma'am!" Brandon Wells barked, his tone as clipped as the smirk playing on his lips. "I need you to step aside for additional screening." Alicia froze. She turned slowly, her eyes locking onto his with a mixture of disbelief and mounting frustration. "You've already checked me," she said, her voice firm but measured. "There's no reason for further screening." Brandon took a step closer, feigning a professional demeanor, but unable to mask the mockery in his tone. "That dress," he said, gesturing vaguely toward her figure, "it's a bit excessive. Could be hiding something dangerous. I'm just doing my job, ma'am." Alicia's jaw tightened. "You're crossing a line," she said, her words sharp and deliberate. His smirk widened. "Ma'am, I'd advise you to cooperate. Otherwise, this could take a lot longer than you'd like." Tension hung heavy in the air as passengers nearby began to notice the exchange. Brandon's voice, though calm on the surface, carried an undertone of power and derision, one that grated against Alicia's patience. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay composed. She wasn't going to let him see how much his behavior bothered her. "Fine," she said, her voice cold. "Do whatever you need to do, but don't think I won't report this." Brandon motioned her to a secondary screening area, with an exaggerated flourish, his condescension on full display. Alicia stepped into the designated space, her head held high despite the humiliation brewing in her chest. What happened next unfolded in slow motion. As Brandon began his inspection, he tugged sharply at the hem of her dress, ostensibly to check for concealed items. The force of the movement caused the fabric to tear, a small but audible rip that seemed to echo across the room. Alicia gasped, her hand instinctively reaching to cover the exposed portion of her leg. Around her, passengers stared in stunned silence. A few began pulling out their phones, their cameras capturing the scene as it unfolded. "What are you doing?" Alicia demanded, her voice rising. Anger and disbelief swirled within her, threatening to boil over. "This is harassment. No, this is assault." Brandon stepped back, his expression feigning innocence. "Relax, Mom," he said coolly. "I'm just being thorough. Security is my job, after all." Alicia's hand trembled as she pointed at him. "You have no right to treat me like this," she said. "Call your supervisor, now." Brandon laughed, a hollow sound that only fanned the flames of Alicia's fury. "You think you can give orders here?" he scoffed. "Who do you think you are?" "I'm someone who knows my rights," Alicia snapped back. Her voice carried a weight of authority that cut through the tension in the room. "And you're going to regret this." A beat passed before another voice broke the silence. "I've recorded the whole thing." A woman stepped forward, her phone still aimed at Brandon. She was tall with sharp features and a no-nonsense air about her. "This behavior is unacceptable," she said, her tone brimming with conviction. "I'm Karen Peterson, and I'll be making sure this gets reported." For the first time, Brandon's confidence wavered. His gaze darted to Karen, then to the other passengers, some of whom were now murmuring among themselves, their disapproval clear. "Ma'am," Brandon began, his tone softening as he raised his hands defensively. "Let's not blow this out of proportion. I'm just following procedure." "Procedure?" Karen shot back, incredulous. "Since when does procedure involve tearing someone's clothing and humiliating them in public?" Alicia, emboldened by Karen's support, turned to Brandon. "Get your supervisor here, or I'll call airport security myself." Brandon hesitated, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the growing crowd and the steady gaze of Karen's camera. He looked over his shoulder, perhaps hoping for backup from his colleagues, but found none. Meanwhile, Jacob Hernandez, a younger TSA officer, watched the scene unfold from a few feet away. His hands fidgeted nervously, and his eyes betrayed a mix of discomfort and indecision. He knew Brandon's actions were out of line, grossly so, but the thought of speaking up against a senior colleague filled him with dread. Karen's voice cut through Jacob's thoughts. "And you?" she asked, turning her camera toward him. "You've been standing there this whole time. Aren't you going to say something?" Jacob's face flushed. He opened his mouth to respond but faltered, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on his chest. I'll get the supervisor," he stammered finally, his voice barely above a whisper. As Jacob hurried off, Alicia pulled out her phone, her fingers moving with precision as she dialed. "Jonathan," she said, her voice firm but edged with tension. "I need you to come to the security checkpoint, immediately." Brandon's expression turned wary at the mention of Jonathan. His confident facade cracked further, revealing a flicker of anxiety. Alicia didn't give him a second glance as she ended the call, her focus squarely on holding him accountable. The minutes that followed were thick with anticipation. The murmurs of onlookers grew louder, and the tension in the air became almost palpable. Alicia stood her ground, her posture unwavering as she awaited the arrival of reinforcements, both from airport authorities and her husband. This was far from over. Alicia stood firm near the security checkpoint, her phone still clenched tightly in her hand after ending the call. The weight of Brandon's actions, coupled with the stares of the growing crowd, felt oppressive, but she refused to waver. Jonathan would arrive soon, and she knew his presence would shift the balance of power in this confrontation. Across the terminal, Jonathan Bennett sat at the head of a sleek conference table in the executive suite of Sapphire Regional Airport. His attention was focused on a presentation detailing the airport's upcoming expansion plans when his phone buzzed insistently. He glanced at the screen and immediately recognized Alicia's number. Excusing himself from the meeting with a curt nod, Jonathan stepped into the hallway and answered the call. "Jonathan," Alicia's voice came through steady but steely, a tone he knew well. "I need you at the security checkpoint, immediately." There was no hesitation. "I'm on my way," he said, already moving. Jonathan's mind raced as he strode down the corridor, his commanding presence turning heads as he passed. He didn't need further details. Alicia's tone told him everything he needed to know. Within minutes, Jonathan descended to the security floor, flanked by two senior members of the airport's management team. The energy in the room shifted the moment he stepped into view. The buzz of passenger chatter quieted, and even the TSA agents seemed to tense under the weight of his presence. Jonathan's tailored suit and confident stride were unmistakable markers of authority, and his expression left no room for doubt. He was here to take control. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Alicia, standing tall despite the obvious strain of the situation. She met his gaze, and in that moment, Jonathan's resolve hardened further. He walked directly toward her, his voice cutting through the still air like a blade. "Who is responsible for screening this passenger?" he demanded, his tone carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being answered promptly. Brandon Wells stepped forward hesitantly, the smirk he'd worn earlier now replaced by a strained attempt at composure. "That would be me, sir," he said, trying to sound professional, but unable to mask the flicker of nervousness in his voice. Jonathan's gaze bore into Brandon, unflinching and unforgiving. "Is that so?" he said, his voice calm but laced with an undertone of steel. "Then perhaps you can explain why my wife, Alicia Bennett, was subjected to such a blatant abuse of authority under your watch." Brandon's confidence faltered. "Sir, I was simply following protocol," he stammered, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Her attire was unusual for a business traveler, and I felt it necessary to ensure there were no security risks." Jonathan took a deliberate step closer, his imposing stature dwarfing Brandon's. "Unusual?" he repeated, his voice dangerously low. "What's unusual is your apparent need to humiliate passengers instead of doing your job properly." Before Brandon could respond, a woman in a TSA supervisor uniform approached the group. Mary Collins, the head of the security division, had been alerted to the escalating situation and arrived just in time to catch Jonathan's last statement. "Mr. Bennett," Mary said, her tone carefully measured, "I understand there's been an issue, and I'd like the opportunity to investigate fully before taking any action." Jonathan turned his attention to her, his expression softening slightly, but retaining its intensity. "Mary," he began, his voice steady, "I'm not here to negotiate. I expect this matter to be handled with the urgency and seriousness it deserves. That man," he gestured toward Brandon without looking at him, "has overstepped his bounds in ways that are both unacceptable and reprehensible. I want him removed from duty immediately." Mary hesitated, the weight of Jonathan's words pressing down on her shoulders. "I understand your concerns," she said, choosing her words carefully, "but as a senior officer, Brandon is entitled to due process. I'll need time to gather all the facts and ensure the correct procedures are followed." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Mary," he said, his tone dropping a fraction, "this isn't about bureaucracy, it's about accountability. Don't mistake my demand for fairness as a lack of resolve. I expect action, not excuses." The tension between them was palpable, the surrounding crowd watching with bated breath. Brandon, sensing the noose tightening around him, made a desperate attempt to regain control. "Mr. Bennett," he interjected, his voice rising slightly. "I was just doing my job. Her dress, well, it could have concealed something. I had to be thorough." Alicia stepped forward then, her voice cutting through Brandon's weak justification. "Don't you dare use your protocol as a shield," she said, her tone sharp and unwavering. "This wasn't about security. This was about your prejudice, your need to exert power over someone you thought wouldn't fight back. Well, guess what? You're wrong." Brandon opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time, he seemed to understand that he was cornered. The room fell into an uneasy silence as Alicia's words reverberated through the space. Brandon's face flushed, his earlier bravado completely stripped away. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Mary Collins for support, but the TSA supervisor remained stone-faced, her own discomfort evident. Jonathan stepped closer to his wife, his presence a shield of calm authority amid the brewing storm. He placed a reassuring hand on Alicia's shoulder before turning back to Mary. "Let's be clear," he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "This isn't just about my wife. It's about ensuring that this kind of behavior is addressed so no one else has to endure it. I'm holding you accountable to make that happen." Mary took a steadying breath, the enormity of the moment settling over her. "Mr. Bennett," she said carefully, "I hear you, and I will make sure this is addressed appropriately. But I cannot remove Brandon from his post without conducting a full investigation. The integrity of our protocols requires due diligence, even in situations like this." Jonathan's gaze hardened, but before he could respond, Alicia raised a hand, her voice cutting through the tension. "No," she said firmly, addressing Mary directly. "This isn't about protecting protocols. It's about protecting people. Protocols didn't stop him from tearing my dress in front of a crowd or treating me like I didn't belong here. So don't tell me they're the reason you can't act now." Her words hung in the air, the surrounding passengers nodding in agreement. Several had begun filming the interaction on their phones, murmurs of support rippling through the crowd. Mary looked visibly torn, caught between the pressure of her position and the undeniable truth of Alicia's words. "I understand your frustration," she said, her voice quieter now. "I will initiate an immediate review of Brandon's actions and place him on temporary suspension while we conduct the investigation." "That's not enough," Jonathan interjected. His tone remained calm, but there was an edge of finality that sent a clear message. He wasn't here for half measures. Brandon, now visibly sweating, made one last attempt to defend himself. "With all due respect, sir," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "I've been working here for years. I've always followed procedure. This was no different." Alicia turned to face him, her expression resolute. "Procedure?" she said, her voice rising slightly. "Let's call this what it is. You singled me out because you thought you could get away with it. And from the looks of it, this isn't the first time you've abused your power. Am I wrong?" Brandon's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked away, unable to meet her piercing gaze. At that moment, Jacob Hernandez, the young TSA officer who had been watching from the sidelines, stepped forward hesitantly. His face was pale, his hands fidgeting nervously. I need to say something," he began, his voice shaky but gaining strength as he continued. "I've worked with Brandon for a while, and this isn't the first time I've seen behavior like this." The crowd fell silent as Jacob's words sank in. Even Mary seemed taken aback. "Jacob," she said, her tone sharp but not unkind, "are you saying you've witnessed misconduct before?" Jacob swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, ma'am, but I didn't speak up because I was afraid of what might happen if I did. But after today, I can't stay quiet anymore." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Brandon's face turned ashen. He took a step back, his earlier defiance completely shattered. Jonathan turned to Mary, his voice measured but firm. "You have what you need now. It's time to take action." Mary nodded slowly, the gravity of the situation evident on her face. "Effective immediately," she said, her voice steady despite the tension. "Brandon Wells is suspended pending a full investigation. He will be escorted from the premises." The announcement sent a wave of relief through the room. Alicia let out a quiet breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Jonathan gave her a small nod, his expression softening as he turned to her. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Alicia met his gaze, her voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. "I will be," she said. "This isn't over, but it's a start." Two security officers approached to escort Brandon away. He cast one last glance at Alicia and Jonathan, his face a mix of anger and humiliation, before being led out of sight. As the crowd began to disperse, Karen Peterson approached Alicia, her phone still in hand. "I've got everything recorded," she said, her tone resolute. "If you need this for anything, you let me know." "Thank you," Alicia replied, her voice warm with gratitude. "Your support means a lot." Karen nodded. "What happened today shouldn't happen to anyone. I'm glad you stood up for yourself. Not everyone would." Alicia smiled faintly. "Sometimes you don't have a choice," she said. With the tension finally easing, Jonathan wrapped an arm around Alicia's shoulder, guiding her toward the terminal. "Let's get you to New York," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "You've got a big day ahead." Alicia nodded, the weight of the confrontation still lingering, but tempered by a growing sense of triumph. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about setting a precedent, about ensuring that no one else had to endure what she had faced today. As they walked away, she glanced back at the checkpoint one last time. The fight wasn't over, but Alicia Bennett had no intention of backing down. The video, sharp and unfiltered, opened with Brandon Wells tugging on the hem of Alicia's dress, the sound of the rip cutting through the faint background hum of the airport. Karen Peterson's steady hand captured every detail, the disbelief on Alicia's face, the growing crowd of onlookers, and Brandon's dismissive attitude as he brushed off Alicia's demands for accountability. Karen posted the video online later that evening, attaching a caption that bristled with indignation. "This is what happens when power is abused. Women of color deserve respect, not humiliation. Share this if you agree." Within hours, the video gained traction, exploding across social media platforms with the force of a thunderclap. By morning, it had amassed millions of views, sparking outrage and solidarity in equal measure. Comments poured in, ranging from expressions of support for Alicia to scathing critiques of systemic prejudice. The hashtags #JusticeForAlicia and #EndAbuseOfPower trended nationwide, transforming the incident into a rallying cry for change. Alicia scrolled through her phone, reading the growing stream of messages and mentions. There were heartfelt notes from women who had faced similar indignities, pledges of support from advocacy groups, and calls for systemic reform. Yet beneath the flood of encouragement lay a darker undercurrent, anonymous accounts questioning her motives, accusing her of exaggeration, or worse, of exploiting her husband's position. She closed her phone and exhaled deeply, steadying herself. Later that morning, Alicia sat across from Thomas Carter at a quiet corner table in a bustling cafe. The attorney, known for his sharp intellect and unwavering commitment to justice, leaned forward with his fingers steepled, his piercing gaze fixed on her. "Alicia," Thomas began, his voice measured but firm, "you've ignited something much bigger than this one incident. The public is watching, and this case could set a precedent. If we pursue legal action, we're not just addressing what happened to you, we're challenging an entire system that allows this kind of behavior to persist." Alicia stirred her coffee absently, her mind turning over his words. "I understand what's at stake," she said, her tone resolute, "but I want to be clear. I'm not doing this for personal vindication. This is about making sure no one else has to endure what I did. If we can change even one policy or hold even one person accountable, it will be worth it." Thomas nodded, his respect for her deepening. "Then we move forward. I'll start with a formal complaint to the TSA and prepare for what's likely to be a very public battle." As they finalized their strategy across the city, Mary Collins convened an emergency meeting at the TSA office. The tension in the room was palpable as she addressed her team, her voice clipped and authoritative. "We need to get ahead of this," she said, gesturing toward a laptop where Karen's viral video played on loop. "This isn't just a PR nightmare, it's a question of our integrity as an organization." Jacob Hernandez sat near the back, his palms damp as he clutched a flash drive containing his own video of the incident. The weight of his silence in the past few months pressed heavily on him now. When Mary called for evidence, Jacob stood hesitantly, all eyes turning toward him as he walked to the front of the room. "I have footage," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It corroborates what the passenger said." Mary inserted the drive into her laptop, and the room fell silent as the footage played. Jacob's recording, though shorter, captured the same troubling sequence of events. Brandon's condescending remarks, the unnecessary search, the tearing of Alicia's dress. It was all there, indisputable. Mary's expression darkened as she turned to face the group. "This isn't the first complaint we've received about Brandon," she admitted, "but until now we lacked concrete evidence to act. That's no longer the case." Later that day, Brandon was summoned to Mary's office. He entered with an air of defiance, though the sweat at his temples betrayed his unease. "Brandon," Mary began, her tone firm, "we've reviewed the footage from yesterday's incident and other reports about your conduct. This behavior is unacceptable and undermines everything this organization stands for." Brandon crossed his arms, his voice rising defensively. "This is a witch hunt. That woman is using her husband's position to retaliate against me. She wanted special treatment, and when she didn't get it, she turned it into a spectacle." Mary cut him off, her patience wearing thin. "Enough. This isn't about her husband, it's about your actions, and this isn't the first time your behavior has been called into question." Brandon's face reddened, but he said nothing further. Mary's decision was clear. He would be suspended pending a full investigation. The fallout reached its peak during Brandon's preliminary hearing. The courtroom was packed, with journalists and onlookers filling every seat. Alicia sat poised at the plaintiff's table, her presence radiating quiet strength. Brandon, seated across from her, looked distinctly smaller than the brash figure he had presented at the airport. The prosecutor presented a compelling case, relying heavily on Karen's video and Jacob's testimony. Alicia's own statement was brief but powerful, recounting the humiliation and injustice she had endured with unwavering composure. "Mrs. Bennett," the judge said, addressing her directly, "your courage in coming forward is commendable. This court will ensure that the truth is brought to light." As the hearing concluded, the judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Brandon left the courtroom flanked by his legal team, his face a mask of frustration and humiliation. For Alicia, the day marked the beginning of a longer journey. She stepped out of the courthouse into the glare of cameras and reporters, her resolve as firm as ever. "This isn't just about me," she told the assembled crowd. "It's about accountability. It's about change, and it's about ensuring that no one else has to face what I faced." The crowd erupted in applause, her words echoing a sentiment that resonated far beyond the courtroom walls. As Alicia drove home that evening, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. She had set something in motion that couldn't be undone, and she wouldn't stop until justice was served. The courtroom was stifling, the air thick with tension as Brandon Wells sat at the defendant's table. His back was rigid and his hands clasped tightly in his lap, as if holding himself together by sheer force of will. Despite his tailored suit and carefully groomed appearance, the cracks in his facade were evident. His eyes darted around the room, occasionally landing on the gallery where Alicia Bennett sat with her lawyer, Thomas Carter. Her calm, composed demeanor only amplified his discomfort. Brandon's face betrayed a mixture of emotions, defiance, fear, and a faint shadow of regret. But it was the lingering trace of arrogance that drew the scornful attention of those in attendance. He had come to court bracing for a fight, but the weight of the evidence against him was impossible to ignore. Karen Peterson was the first to testify. She approached the stand with steady determination, her gaze unwavering as she recounted the events of that fateful morning. "I was standing just a few feet away when it happened," she began, her voice clear and precise. "I saw Mr. Wells single out Mrs. Bennett for unnecessary scrutiny, and his behavior was nothing short of demeaning. He tore her dress in front of a crowd of onlookers, then dismissed her concerns as if they were trivial." Karen's testimony was bolstered by the now infamous video she had recorded. The courtroom fell silent as the footage played on a large screen, every humiliating detail laid bare for all to see. Gasps rippled through the gallery when Brandon's smirk was captured on camera, his dismissive words ringing loudly in the enclosed space. Next came Jacob Hernandez. The young TSA officer shifted nervously in his seat as he took the stand, but his voice grew stronger with each word. "I worked with Brandon for years," he admitted, his hands trembling slightly, "and I saw him cross the line more than once, but I stayed quiet because I was afraid of losing my job. Watching what he did to Mrs. Bennett made me realize that staying silent only enables people like him to keep hurting others." Jacob's honesty brought a solemn weight to the proceedings, his confession adding another layer of credibility to the case against Brandon. Public outrage had reached a fever pitch by this point. Karen's video had become a centerpiece of the trial and a focal point for national conversations about abuse of power and systemic bias. Media coverage dissected every detail, from Brandon's smug demeanor during the incident to Alicia's unshakable poise in the aftermath. Outside the courthouse, protesters held signs that read, "Justice for Alicia" and "End TSA abuse," their chants audible even from inside the courtroom. As Alicia listened to the testimonies, she felt a complex mix of emotions: vindication for her decision to fight back, anger at Brandon's actions, and a profound sense of responsibility for the voices that hadn't yet been heard. During a recess, she and Thomas sat in a quiet room adjacent to the courtroom. Alicia rubbed her temples, her thoughts heavy. "Thomas," she began, her voice low, "I don't want this to just end with Brandon. What he did is part of a larger problem. How do we address the system that allowed him to get away with this for so long?" Thomas leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Change doesn't happen all at once," he said. "It starts with moments like this, holding individuals accountable and shining a light on the flaws in the system. Brandon is just one piece of a much bigger puzzle, but by taking him to court, you're starting a conversation that can lead to broader reforms." His words offered a measure of comfort, but Alicia's resolve only deepened. She couldn't shake the thought of others who had suffered similar indignities without the resources or platform to fight back. The trial took a dramatic turn when an unexpected witness stepped forward. A woman in her late 30s with a composed but weary expression approached the stand. She introduced herself as Lydia Monroe, a former TSA contractor who had worked under Brandon's supervision years earlier. "I never thought I'd have the courage to speak about this," Lydia said, her voice trembling slightly. "But after seeing what Mrs. Bennett went through, I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore. Brandon Wells harassed me during my time at TSA. He made inappropriate comments, belittled me in front of colleagues, and even threatened my job when I tried to stand up for myself. I left that job because I couldn't take it anymore." The courtroom was silent, the gravity of Lydia's words sinking in. Even Brandon seemed to shrink under the weight of her testimony. For the first time, his defiance faltered and his head dipped slightly, his expression unreadable. Lydia's bravery left an indelible mark on everyone present. Alicia felt a surge of gratitude toward the woman, whose story reinforced the broader implications of their fight for justice. After the day's proceedings, Brandon left the courthouse through a side exit, shielded by his lawyers from the growing crowd of reporters and protesters. His mother waited for him at home, her face etched with disappointment. That evening, as they sat across from each other in the quiet of the family kitchen, she finally spoke. "Brandon," she said, her voice heavy with emotion, "do you understand what you've done? You've not only destroyed your own reputation, you've betrayed the trust of everyone who believed in you, including me." Her words hit him harder than any courtroom testimony. Brandon stared at the table, his hands gripping the edges as if trying to anchor himself. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "It's not about what you meant," she shot back. "It's about what you did, and now you have to live with the consequences." That night, for the first time, Brandon began to grapple with the depth of the harm he had caused. By the end of the trial's preliminary phase, the judge issued a temporary order barring Brandon from working in any capacity within the aviation industry until further notice. His career, once marked by authority and confidence, now lay in ruins. For Alicia, the ruling brought a sense of closure, but not satisfaction. As she left the courthouse surrounded by supporters and reporters, she couldn't help but think of the other victims who hadn't received justice. The fight was far from over, but for now, it was a step in the right direction. As she drove home, the city lights blurred past her window, her thoughts heavy with the weight of the day's events. She knew that holding Brandon accountable was just the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead in ensuring that his actions served as a catalyst for change, not just a cautionary tale. The room was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the soft glow of a desk lamp. Brandon Wells sat hunched over a sheet of paper, his pen hovering uncertainly above the page. The once confident TSA officer now looked hollow, his expression a mixture of guilt and uncertainty. The silence was broken only by the faint scratch of his pen as he finally began to write. "Mrs. Bennett," the letter began, his handwriting shaky but deliberate. "I've spent countless hours replaying what happened, trying to understand how I let myself become the person who could treat another human being with such disrespect. I didn't realize until it was too late that my actions didn't just harm you, they diminished me as well." The words came slowly at first, each one dredged from a deep well of shame and reflection. Brandon poured his thoughts onto the page, recounting the realization that his behavior stemmed not from protocol, but from prejudice and a misguided sense of authority. "I don't expect your forgiveness," he wrote, "and I'm not asking for it. What I hope for is the chance to make amends, to turn this experience into something meaningful. I understand now that change begins with accountability, and I am ready to face the consequences of my actions." When the letter was finished, Brandon set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, his chest rising and falling with a heavy sigh. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of relief, not from absolution, but from the act of confronting his own culpability. The letter arrived at Alicia's home a few days later. She held the envelope in her hands for a moment, hesitating before carefully opening it. As her eyes scanned the neatly written words, her emotions shifted from anger to disbelief, and finally to a complicated blend of sadness and frustration. She read the letter twice, her mind grappling with its implications. Brandon's admission of guilt was unexpected, but it did little to erase the pain he had caused. That evening she shared the letter with Jonathan, her voice measured but tinged with an edge of uncertainty. "What do you think?" she asked, placing the letter on the table between them. Jonathan picked it up, his brow furrowing as he read. When he was finished, he leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed thoughtfully. "It sounds sincere," he said finally, "but sincerity doesn't undo what he did." Alicia nodded, her expression distant. "I know. But it's not about him, it's about me. I can't keep holding on to this anger. It's like carrying a weight that only drags me down." Jonathan reached for her hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," he said. "It means freeing yourself from the burden of someone else's mistakes." The next day, as Alicia sat in the courtroom for Brandon's sentencing hearing, her mind raced with conflicting thoughts. When the judge called her to the stand, she rose slowly, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady but resolute, "I'm here today not just as a victim, but as someone who believes in the power of change. I don't want to see Mr. Wells's life destroyed. What I want is for him to understand the harm he's caused, not just to me, but to others who have faced similar treatment." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. "Instead of seeking retribution, I'm asking for an opportunity for him to make amends. I propose a sentence that includes community service and mandatory education on equality and social awareness. Let his punishment serve as a lesson, not just to him, but to anyone who thinks they can misuse their power without consequence." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs of surprise. A few faces in the gallery showed clear disapproval, particularly among those who had supported Alicia's fight for justice. One woman, a former TSA employee who had testified earlier, stood abruptly and shook her head in frustration. "He doesn't deserve this leniency," she said aloud, her voice carrying a note of bitterness. "People like him never change." The judge silenced the room with a firm rap of his gavel. He turned to Alicia, his expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, "your perspective is commendable. It's not often that victims advocate for rehabilitation over punishment. I will take your request into serious consideration." After a brief recess, the judge returned with his decision. Brandon was sentenced to 500 hours of community service, including work in areas focused on diversity education and public outreach. He was also required to attend a year-long program aimed at addressing implicit bias and systemic prejudice. "This sentence," the judge said, his tone firm, "is not a reprieve. It is an opportunity for Mr. Wells to confront the harm he has caused and to work toward meaningful change. Let this serve as a reminder that accountability is not just about punishment, it's about transformation." As Brandon left the courtroom, his face was a mixture of relief and resignation. The weight of the sentence was heavy, but for the first time he felt a spark of determination to prove that he could do better. Outside the courthouse, Alicia stood before a throng of reporters, her composure as unwavering as ever. Microphones and cameras surrounded her, their lenses capturing every word as she addressed the public. "This story isn't about revenge," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "It's about creating a society where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. We can't change the past, but we can shape the future, and that starts with accountability and education." Her words were met with applause, a ripple of hope spreading through the gathered crowd. In the weeks that followed, Brandon began his community service at the very airport, where his actions had ignited a national conversation. The stares from his former colleagues and passengers were difficult to bear, but he pushed through, determined to show that he was committed to change. Meanwhile, Alicia's story continued to resonate across the country. She became a prominent advocate for systemic reform, her unwavering courage inspiring others to stand up against injustice. For Alicia, the journey was far from over, but she faced it with the same resilience and grace that had carried her through the darkest moments of her ordeal. As the days turned into weeks, a subtle but profound shift began to take hold. Brandon, once the embodiment of unchecked authority, was now a man seeking redemption. And Alicia, a woman whose strength had ignited change, became a beacon of hope in a world that so desperately needed it. The courtroom was hushed as the judge delivered the final ruling. Brandon Wells sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped tightly, his face pale. His lawyer sat beside him, leaning forward slightly as if bracing for a heavier sentence. Across the room, Alicia Bennett sat tall and composed, her expression a mixture of resolve and anticipation. The judge, an older man with a calm but authoritative demeanor, cleared his throat before speaking. "Mr. Wells," he began, his voice steady, "this court has reviewed the evidence presented against you, and the testimonies have been clear and consistent. Your actions were not only an abuse of your position, but also a breach of the trust placed in you by both your employer and the public." Brandon shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening as the weight of the judge's words bore down on him. "You have caused significant harm, not only to Mrs. Bennett but to the community as a whole," the judge continued. "However, this court also recognizes the importance of rehabilitation and the potential for individuals to learn from their mistakes. Therefore, it is the decision of this court that you will serve 200 hours of community service at Sapphire Regional Airport, where you will contribute in a capacity that reflects humility and accountability. Additionally, you are required to complete a 1-year program focused on social awareness and equity training. Let this opportunity serve as a chance for you to truly understand the damage you've caused and to begin the process of making amends." He paused, his gaze locking onto Brandon. "Make no mistake," the judge said firmly. "This is not leniency. This is a responsibility, a chance to rebuild yourself and prove that you are capable of change. Use it wisely." The gavel struck and the courtroom erupted into a mix of murmurs. Some in the audience nodded in agreement, appreciating the balance of justice and rehabilitation, while others shook their heads in disapproval. As Brandon stood to leave, escorted by his attorney, his shoulders slumped under the weight of the sentence. Meanwhile, Alicia stepped into the blinding light of reporters' cameras waiting outside the courthouse. Questions flew from every direction, but she raised a hand to quiet them. "This case was never about revenge," Alicia said, her voice steady but resolute. "It's about accountability and the belief that people can change when given the opportunity. Forgiveness does not mean excusing the harm that was done, but it does mean choosing to break the cycle of anger and resentment. I hope Mr. Wells uses this chance to learn and to contribute positively to society." Her words were met with applause from some onlookers, but not everyone was convinced. Among the crowd was Lydia Monroe, a former TSA employee who had testified during the trial about Brandon's previous misconduct. Lydia's face was tight with anger as she turned to a nearby reporter. "He gets to walk away with community service while the rest of us are left with scars," Lydia said bitterly. "What about the damage he's done to people like me? How do we move on when there's no real accountability?" Inside the courthouse, Karen Peterson approached Alicia, her phone tucked into her bag after capturing the moment on video. Karen's expression was thoughtful, a mixture of admiration and concern. "Do you think this will make a difference?" Karen asked. "You've taken the high road, but aren't you worried people will misunderstand your intentions, that they'll think you let him off easy?" Alicia sighed, the weight of the past weeks pressing heavily on her. "I think about that every day," she admitted. "But if we stay trapped in anger, nothing changes. If we don't give people the chance to do better, we're just perpetuating the same cycle of bitterness and blame. This isn't about him. It's about what kind of world I want to help create." Karen studied Alicia for a moment before nodding. "You're braver than most people I know," she said. Meanwhile, Brandon's new reality began to take shape. On his first day of community service at Sapphire Regional Airport, he was assigned to the baggage area. Wearing a plain reflective vest, he hauled suitcases and cleaned up litter while passengers moved through the terminal above. The whispers and sidelong glances from former colleagues were hard to ignore, each one a painful reminder of how far he had fallen. One passenger, recognizing him from the viral video, smirked as they passed by. "Look who's cleaning up after us now," the man said loudly, drawing chuckles from others nearby. Brandon clenched his jaw but said nothing, focusing instead on his work. The hours passed slowly, the monotony of the task giving him plenty of time to reflect. When his shift ended, he sat on a bench near the terminal, staring at the planes taxiing on the runway. "How did I get here?" he muttered under his breath. "How do I make this right?" It was the first time he truly confronted the depth of his actions and their consequences. The shame was overwhelming, but alongside it came a flicker of determination. If he couldn't erase the harm he had caused, he could at least try to build something better from the wreckage. The days turned into weeks, and as Brandon continued his community service, he began to notice small shifts in his interactions. A few co-workers who had initially avoided him started to acknowledge his efforts, offering brief but polite greetings. The jeers from passengers became less frequent as the public's attention moved on to new stories. For Brandon, each day was a step toward redemption. Not a leap, but a slow and deliberate process of earning back the trust he had lost. For Alicia, the trial and its aftermath became a defining chapter in her journey. She emerged not just as a victim, but as a voice for change, her story inspiring conversations about equity and accountability across the nation. Her decision to advocate for rehabilitation over punishment sparked debates, but it also planted seeds of hope in those who believed in second chances. As the sun set over the city one evening, Alicia stood on her porch, watching the golden light fade into dusk. She thought about everything that had transpired, the pain, the fight, and the progress. While the road ahead was still long, she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. Change, she realized, was never easy, but it was always worth the effort. Brandon Wells stood near the back of the crowded hall, watching as volunteers bustled about, setting up for the airport's charity fundraiser. The room was alive with conversation and laughter, a stark contrast to the turmoil that had defined his recent months. Wearing a plain volunteer badge over his work clothes, Brandon quietly unloaded boxes of supplies, doing his best to blend into the background. He wasn't expecting anyone to recognize him, but as he carried a tray of materials to one of the tables, he froze. Standing just a few feet away was a woman he hadn't seen in years, her posture tense, her eyes locked on him with a mix of disbelief and anger. "You!" she said, her voice cutting through the hum of the room like a knife. Brandon set the tray down carefully, his heart pounding. "I remember you," the woman continued, stepping closer. "Do you remember me?" He nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "I remember." She crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "You made my life hell," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You humiliated me in front of my colleagues. I almost lost my job because of you." Brandon didn't flinch. "I know," he said, his voice laden with regret. "And I'm sorry, truly." "Sorry?" she snapped. "You think a few hours of community service makes up for what you did? For what people like you put people like me through?" "No," Brandon replied, his tone firm but calm. "I don't think that. I don't think anything could make up for it, but I'm trying to start somewhere. For a moment, the woman said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then she shook her head and turned away, her footsteps brisk as she disappeared into the crowd. Brandon let out a slow breath, the encounter leaving him shaken but resolute. He had hoped for forgiveness, but he knew it wasn't something he could demand or expect. A week later, Brandon attended his first social awareness class. The room was small, the air thick with discomfort as participants shuffled awkwardly in their seats. The instructor, a confident woman with a calm but commanding presence, began by asking everyone to introduce themselves and share why they were there. When it was Brandon's turn, he hesitated before speaking. "My name is Brandon," he said, his voice subdued. "I'm here because I abused my position and hurt people. I didn't see it then, but I see it now." The instructor nodded, her expression neutral. "Good. Admitting the problem is the first step, but acknowledgement without action means nothing." As the class progressed, the instructor posed a question that hit Brandon harder than he expected. "When you behaved the way you did," she asked, "did you ever stop to think about the impact it would have on others? Did you consider how it might make them feel?" Brandon felt the weight of the question settle over him. "No," he said finally. "I didn't think. I just acted. And that was the biggest mistake I made." The room was silent for a moment, the gravity of his words sinking in. For Brandon, the session wasn't just an education. It was a confrontation with his own failings, an unflinching look at the harm he had caused. Later that month, Brandon crossed paths with Alicia for the first time since the trial. She was at the airport, attending a meeting with administrators about ongoing reforms. They saw each other in the hallway, their eyes meeting briefly before Brandon stepped forward hesitantly. "Mrs. Bennett," he began, his voice low. "Thank you for what you said in court. I know I don't deserve another chance, but because of you, I have one, and I just want to say thank you." Alicia regarded him carefully, her expression unreadable. "I didn't do it for you," she said finally. "I did it for the people who come after me, so they won't have to go through what I did." Brandon nodded, her words cutting deeper than any reprimand. "I understand," he said, "but I promise I'll do whatever it takes to prove that I'm better than who I was." In the weeks that followed, Brandon began approaching his community service with a renewed sense of purpose. One day, while cleaning in the baggage claim area, he noticed an elderly passenger struggling with a heavy suitcase. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, offering a kind smile as he lifted the bag onto the cart. "Thank you," the man said, his face lighting up with gratitude. Brandon nodded, feeling an unfamiliar but welcome warmth in the simple act of helping someone. It was a stark contrast to the indifference he had once carried, a small but meaningful step toward becoming someone better. He also started participating in community events, including a workshop on workplace equity and diversity. At one event, he stood before a group of young professionals, his voice steady as he shared his story. "I'm not proud of who I was," he said, "but I'm working every day to be someone different, someone better. If sharing my mistakes helps even one person avoid making the same ones, then it's worth it." The audience listened intently, and after the session, a young woman approached him. "I used to think people like you couldn't change," she admitted, "but hearing you today, maybe I was wrong." Brandon's transformation wasn't easy, nor was it linear. There were setbacks, moments of self-doubt, and encounters that reopened old wounds. But through it all, he persisted, driven by the desire to right his wrongs and prove that change was possible. One evening, after a particularly challenging day, he stood in front of his bathroom mirror, his reflection staring back at him. For the first time in years, he didn't see the man who had let arrogance and prejudice define him. Instead, he saw someone striving to be better, not perfect, but better. And for Brandon, that was a beginning. The press conference was held in the grand atrium of Sapphire Regional Airport, a symbolic backdrop chosen for its significance to the events that had sparked a national conversation. Cameras flashed, and reporters jostled for position as Alicia Bennett and her husband Jonathan stepped onto the podium. Behind them, a banner displayed the slogan of their new initiative, "Equity in Action, a commitment to change." Jonathan began the address, his voice steady and commanding. The events that unfolded here months ago were painful, but they also revealed an opportunity to reflect, to grow, and to create meaningful change. Today, we are proud to announce a series of reforms aimed at fostering equity, respect, and accountability within the TSA and beyond. He gestured toward Alicia, who stepped forward with a poise that had become her hallmark. Her words were direct yet hopeful. These reforms include comprehensive training programs on cultural awareness and diversity for all TSA employees. We're also implementing new oversight measures to ensure that every passenger is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of who they are or where they come from. This isn't just about addressing one incident, it's about reimagining the way we treat each other. The room erupted into applause, but the reactions weren't universally positive. Online, the response to their announcement reflected a similar divide. While many hailed Alicia as a beacon of strength and compassion, others criticized the reforms as insufficient. "This is just window dressing," one comment read. "It won't fix the systemic issues." When asked about these criticisms in an interview, Alicia responded thoughtfully. "No change is perfect at the outset," she said, "but every step forward, no matter how small, brings us closer to a fairer, more inclusive society. The real danger lies in doing nothing at all." As Alicia became a symbol of resilience and progress, Karen Peterson found herself stepping into a new role as well. The video she had recorded had been a catalyst for the entire movement, and now Karen was sharing her experience at community forums and educational workshops. At one such event, Karen stood before a group of college students, recounting the moment she decided to hit record on her phone. "It would have been easier to look away," she admitted, "but silence only empowers those who abuse their authority. Each of us has a responsibility to stand up when we see injustice. It's not always comfortable, but it's always necessary." Her words resonated deeply, and afterward, several attendees approached her, inspired to take a more active stance against wrongdoing in their own lives. Meanwhile, Brandon Wells had begun his own journey toward redemption. As part of his community service, he was invited to speak at a youth leadership seminar. Standing before a room of high school students, Brandon felt a twinge of apprehension. How could he, with all his failings, offer guidance to these bright, hopeful faces? But when he began to speak, his honesty broke through the tension. "I'm not here to justify my mistakes," he said, his voice steady but subdued. "I'm here to own them. I let my position blind me to the responsibility I had to treat others with respect. That was my failure. But what I've learned is this: mistakes don't define you. How you choose to make amends does." The students listened intently, and by the end of his talk, a young man approached him. "Hearing you today made me think about my own actions," the boy said quietly. "I want to make sure I don't take my own privileges for granted." Brandon left the event with a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't about erasing the past, it was about building a future he could be proud of. Back at Sapphire Regional Airport, small but significant changes were taking root. Employees who had once viewed diversity training as an obligation now approached it with genuine curiosity and engagement. Passengers began to notice a shift in the way TSA agents interacted with them: more patience, more professionalism, more respect. Jacob Hernandez, the young officer who had testified during Brandon's trial, found himself promoted to a leadership role. His integrity and courage had set an example for his peers, and he became a trusted advocate for fairness within the TSA ranks. Months later, at a ceremony celebrating the progress made under the Equity in Action initiative, Alicia stood at the front of a packed auditorium. Her son Ethan sat in the front row, beaming with pride, while Jonathan watched her with quiet admiration. As she scanned the audience, Alicia saw faces from every corner of her journey: supporters, skeptics, and even Brandon standing unobtrusively at the back. "This isn't the end," she said, her voice carrying a quiet strength. "It's a beginning. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without struggle. But together, step by step, we can create a world where dignity and respect are not privileges, but rights." The room erupted into applause, and for a moment, Alicia allowed herself to feel the full weight of what they had accomplished. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't finished, but it was progress, and progress was worth celebrating. Brandon Wells stood outside the modest brick building of the community center, the crisp morning air filling his lungs as he prepared for another day of work. Since completing his community service and training, Brandon had found a new purpose, volunteering at an organization that supported victims of discrimination and systemic injustice. The work was humbling but deeply fulfilling, allowing him to channel his energy into something that mattered. In quieter moments, Brandon kept a journal. He filled its pages with reflections on his journey, his mistakes, the pain he caused, and the lessons he was learning. Writing became a way for him to confront his past honestly while documenting his commitment to change. One evening he wrote, "I can never undo what I've done, but every step I take now is a chance to build something better." A few weeks later, Brandon encountered Alicia Bennett for what would likely be their final meeting. It was at a public event promoting workplace equity, a cause Alicia had championed since the trial. Spotting her from across the room, Brandon hesitated before walking over, his steps tentative. When Alicia noticed him, she turned, her expression unreadable. Brandon cleared his throat. "Mrs. Bennett," he began, his voice steady but humble. "I know I can't undo the harm I caused, but I wanted to thank you. Your grace, your strength, it gave me the push I needed to change. I hope in some way I can make a difference now." Alicia regarded him for a moment before speaking. "What's done is done, Mr. Wells," she said. "But the most meaningful thing you can do now is ensure that no one else has to go through what I did. That's how you truly make amends." Brandon nodded, her words resonating deeply. "I will," he promised. "Thank you for giving me that chance." Elsewhere, the Bennett family's impact continued to grow. Alicia and Jonathan's son, Ethan, now a teenager, spoke during an interview at school about the lessons he'd learned from his mother. "My mum is the strongest person I know," he said with pride. "She fought for what was right, but she also showed me that forgiveness is a kind of strength too. It's about moving forward without letting anger hold you back." Jonathan, too, reflected on the journey their family had taken. At a community event, he spoke to a crowd about the collective effort behind meaningful change. "What we've accomplished didn't come from one person," he said. "It came from courage, from compassion, and from a shared belief that we can create a better future together." As the event continued, Alicia addressed the audience with her signature calm and conviction. "Each of us has the power to make a difference," she said. "It doesn't matter how small it seems. When you see injustice, stand up. When you see someone hurting, help them. Change begins with ordinary people choosing to do what's right." The evening ended with a standing ovation as the Bennett family stood together on stage, Alicia, Jonathan, and Ethan. The applause swelled around them, a tribute to their strength and resilience. Alicia looked out over the crowd, her eyes shining with hope. The image of the three of them together, framed by the soft glow of stage lights, captured the essence of their journey. It wasn't about perfection, but persistence. It wasn't about anger, but action. And as Alicia smiled, her expression became a symbol of the unwavering belief that even in the face of hardship, kindness and determination could lead to meaningful change. This story reminds us of the transformative power of accountability, forgiveness, and compassion. It's a testament to the strength of those who fight for justice and the courage it takes to confront past mistakes and seek redemption. Every act of kindness, no matter how small, can inspire change in the world around us. What are your thoughts on the lessons from this story? Share your perspective in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt stories that touch the soul. Thank you for being part of our community.